I noticed the cologne on his jacket before he even closed the front door. Not perfume. Cologne. Something woody and expensive that I didn't recognize, which meant it wasn't mine, and it wasn't his. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door the same way he had every night for 6 years, kissed me on the cheek, asked what was for dinner. And I stood there in our kitchen holding a wooden spoon, thinking, that scent doesn't belong in this house. I didn't say anything. That was October. My husband and I met when I was 24. I was finishing up my master's in urban planning at Ohio State, juggling a thesis on transit infrastructure and a part-time job at a coffee shop that paid for exactly nothing important. He was 31, already a project manager at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, and he walked into that coffee shop one Tuesday morning, looking like someone who had his whole life sorted out in a way I deeply envied. We dated for a year, got engaged, got married in a small ceremony in Columbus with about 60 people, mostly family and a few close friends. We bought a house in Clintonville, a pale yellow craftsman with a front porch and a maple tree in the backyard that turned the most extraordinary shade of red every fall. I loved that house. I want to be clear about that. I loved it before everything happened, and I loved it after, and loving it didn't make any of what came next easier. I was 27 when we got married. He was 34. For the first 3 years, things were genuinely good. We cooked together on Sundays. We drove to my parents' place in Cincinnati for Thanksgiving. We had a dog named after a character from a TV show we used to watch together, and we argued about whose turn it was to take her to the vet, and that felt like the most complicated problem in our life together. Then his company landed a major development contract on the west side of Columbus. He started working longer hours, started coming home later. I was deep into my own career by then. I'd been hired full-time by a city planning consultancy, working on zoning cases and public comment reviews, so at first I didn't register the shift. We were both just busy. That's what I told myself. The dog got older. We talked about having kids, maybe someday, not yet. We stopped watching the TV show together. I started eating dinner alone more nights than not. I told myself that was just what marriage looked like after a few years. I had seen it in my parents, in my friends' marriages, in every rom-com that bothers to show what happens after the credits roll. You settle into parallel lives. You love each other from separate rooms. I convinced myself that was normal. I was wrong about what was normal and also wrong about what was actually happening. The woman's name was Sienna. I didn't know that in October when I first smelled the cologne. I didn't know it in November, when he started taking his phone into the bathroom. I didn't know it until December, 3 days before Christmas, when he left his laptop open on the kitchen counter and walked out to start his car, and I saw a message preview on the screen before I could look away. Last night was everything. Don't feel guilty. You deserve this. I stood very still. The coffee maker beeped. Outside, I could hear his car running in the driveway. I closed the laptop. I poured my coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table and I thought, very carefully and very quietly, about what I was going to do next. He came back inside to grab his keys. I smiled at him. He kissed my forehead. He left for work. I sat there for another 40 minutes and then I called my office and said I was working from home. Then I called my best friend who had been saying for 2 months that something seemed off with me, and I told her what I had seen. She drove over in 20 minutes. She brought a box of donuts, which is exactly the right response to a situation like that, and we sat at my kitchen table and she held my hand and I cried for the first time since October. Then I stopped crying, and I started thinking, I want to be honest about who I was in those weeks. I wasn't graceful. I wasn't some calm, steely woman who moves through betrayal with quiet dignity. I was a mess privately. I cried in the car on the way to work. I lost 7 pounds in 6 weeks because I kept forgetting to eat. I called my mother twice and hung up before she answered because I didn't know how to say the words out loud. But I also didn't confront him. Not yet. Some people ask me why. Why didn't I just say something the moment I saw that message? Why did I let it go on for another 6 weeks? because I needed to know what I was dealing with before I dealt with it. Because I had watched enough of my friends walk into confrontations empty-handed and walk out with nothing but a husband's denial and their own doubt. Because I had a joint mortgage, a joint checking account, a joint life, and I needed to understand exactly what my exit looked like before I opened that door. So I talked to an attorney. Her name is not important, but she was small and precise and sat behind a very organized desk in a building downtown, and she told me things I needed to know about Ohio divorce law, about marital assets, about what documentation would matter and what wouldn't. I paid for the consultation out of my personal savings account, the one he'd never asked about because he didn't know it existed. I had kept it since before we married. Not because I planned for this, just because my grandmother always told me a woman should have her own money, and I had listened. I didn't file anything, not then. I just needed to understand the map. Then I went home and I made dinner, and I waited. He told me in January. We were sitting in the living room a Sunday night, and I remember the exact sound of the TV in the background and the exact way he cleared his throat twice before he spoke. The way a person does when they've rehearsed something so many times that saying it out loud has become a separate act from meaning it. He said he hadn't been happy in a long time. He said he felt like I had built my whole life around work and we had stopped being partners and more like roommates. He said he needed to be honest with me because he respected me. I looked at him. I thought about the message on the laptop screen. I thought about the cologne in October. I thought about 6 years of Sunday dinners and the maple tree in the backyard and the dog asleep on the floor between us right then, completely unaware that everything was ending. I said, "Okay, tell me what you want to do." He looked surprised. I think he expected me to cry, or yell, or beg. I didn't do any of those things. He said he thought we should separate. He said there was someone else. He said it had happened gradually, that it wasn't planned, that he was sorry. I said, "How long?" He said, 6 months. 6 months meant May, which meant while we were at my cousin's wedding in July, dancing to an old Motown song on a rented dance floor in an Ohio barn, he had already been with someone else for 2 months. He had held my hand on the drive home. He had told me he loved me. I did not say any of this out loud. I said, "I think you should stay at a hotel tonight." He blinked. He said he hadn't expected me to react this way. I said, "I know." He left within the hour. The house was very quiet after he left. The dog walked to the door, sniffed the gap at the bottom, and then came and put her head in my lap. And I sat on the couch in the dark and thought about nothing for a very long time. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I would feel demolished. I thought the floor would come out from under me. Instead, I felt something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of carrying something heavy for a long time without realizing how heavy it was, and finally being allowed to put it down. I called my best friend again. She came back over. She brought wine this time, which was a different kind of right answer. We stayed up until 2 in the morning and I told her everything and she told me I was going to be okay, and I didn't believe her yet, but I wrote it down in my journal anyway. The way you write down something you want to remember to believe later. He moved in with Sienna in February. I know this because he told me in the tone of a man who has decided honesty is the same thing as cruelty during a phone call where we were supposedly discussing logistics of dividing our shared bank account. He said she lived in a condo in the short north. He said it was temporary. He said he hoped I understood. I said, "I'm going to need you to communicate through my attorney going forward." Another silence. He said he thought we could handle this like adults. I said we can. That's why I'm asking you to go through my attorney. I gave him her contact information. I hung up. Then I sat in my car in the parking garage under my office building for about 10 minutes doing the breathing exercise my therapist had taught me, the one where you exhale for twice as long as you inhale. It helps. I recommend it. My consultancy had offered me twice in the last 18 months a senior associate position that came with a pay increase and lead responsibility on larger projects. Twice, I had turned it down because of vague reasons I told myself were about work-life balance, but were actually about keeping my schedule open for a marriage that had already stopped asking anything of me. In March, I accepted it. My supervisor looked at me across the conference table and said she was genuinely glad and also genuinely confused because she had expected me to say no again, and I told her I was in a different place now than I had been, and she nodded like she understood, which maybe she did. I threw myself into the new role the way you throw yourself into anything when you need something to hold on to. I was in the office early. I was organized in a way I had not been in years. I had a project on a mixed-use development in the short north, the irony of which was not lost on me. And I worked on it with the focus that my team noticed and commented on. I also, very quietly, began working with my attorney on the divorce proceedings. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital property is divided fairly but not necessarily equally. The house had appreciated considerably since we bought it. My attorney advised me on what to expect, what to document, what to push for. I kept records of everything. I was methodical about it in the way I had learned to be methodical about zoning cases. Slow, detailed, unglamorous work that matters enormously at the end. I found out in April that things with Sienna were not going well. I didn't seek out this information. I want to be clear about that. I was not tracking him. But Columbus is not a small town, and it is also not a big enough city to make coincidence impossible. And I ran into a colleague of his at a work event in April, and she mentioned, in the conspiratorial way that people mention things they assume everyone already knows, that the situation with the woman in the short north had apparently become complicated. I said, complicated how? She said, she apparently wanted things to stay casual and he had a different idea. I drove home thinking about that. Thinking about a man who left his wife of 6 years for a casual situation. Thinking about how a person can burn their life down for something and not check whether the something wanted to be held. I felt something then that I'm not proud of. I want to be honest about that too. I felt satisfied, not happy, not relieved, just satisfied. The way you feel when a mathematical proof resolves correctly, when the numbers balance at the end. I didn't call anyone to share it, I just let it sit. In May, my husband called me for the first time since I'd asked him to communicate through my attorney. I almost didn't answer. I was in the backyard watching the dog run slow circles around the maple tree in the late afternoon light. The yard looked good. I had started doing the landscaping myself on weekends, which was something I had always meant to do and never made time for. I answered because I was feeling generous that day, or maybe just curious. He sounded different. Not defeated exactly, but quieter than I remembered. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He asked about the dog. I told him I was fine. He asked about the dog. I told her she was doing well. Then he said he wanted to talk. I said, talk. Then, he said he had made a mistake, that he had realized it slowly and then all at once. That Sienna had ended things, and being away from our house, away from our routines, away from the life we had built together, had made him see what he had walked away from. I didn't say anything. He said he thought maybe we had given up too quickly, that he would do the work this time, that if I was willing, he wanted to try. I sat down in the grass next to the dog. She put her chin on my knee. I thought about October. I thought about the cologne. I thought about the message on the laptop screen. I thought about December and January and the rehearsed speech in the living room. I thought about my cousin's wedding in July and his hand in mine on the drive home. I thought about how I'd eaten dinner alone more nights than not for 2 years and called it normal. I thought about the senior associate position I had finally taken, the project in the short north I was proud of, the backyard I had planted myself, the version of myself I had been slowly, quietly reconstructing since January. Not out of spite, but out of the simple necessity of continuing to exist. I said, I don't think that's something I want. He was quiet for a long time. He said, you seem different. I said, I am. He said, I'm sorry. I mean that. I said, I know you do. And then I said, I hope you find your way. I mean that too. I hung up and sat in the grass until the light changed and the dog got up and went to the door to be let in. The divorce was finalized in August. We sold the house. This part was not simple. It required both our signatures and a real estate agent and several weeks of negotiations through our respective attorneys, and one genuinely terrible afternoon where we had to be in the same room for a walkthrough and made small talk about the maple tree like two people. Lyd never shared anything more than a property line. We split the proceeds down the middle, which was less than I would have liked and more than I expected. I moved into an apartment in Victorian Village, 3rd floor, high ceilings, original hardwood floors, 2 blocks from a good coffee shop and 4 blocks from Goodale Park, where I started running in the mornings the way my therapist had been suggesting for months. The dog came with me, obviously. I painted the living room a deep green that my best friend said was either very sophisticated or a cry for help, and I told her it was both and she laughed, and we opened a bottle of wine and sat on the floor surrounded by boxes, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely at ease. I want to say something about the word boring because he used it, eventually, in a conversation with a mutual friend that got back to me the way things always do in a city this size. He said our marriage had become boring, that he had felt invisible, that he needed someone who made him feel alive. I have thought about this a lot. I have thought about how boring is always attributed to the marriage, never to the person inside it who decided to stop trying. How the invisible feeling is projected outward, onto a wife, a house, a routine, instead of examined as the internal condition it actually is. How needing to feel alive is treated as a reasonable justification for burning down the lives of the people around you. I have thought about all the small ways I kept asking him to try. The weekend trips I planned that he canceled. The dinners I cooked for 2 when he came home at 9. The conversations I started about what we needed, which he redirected or minimized or simply walked away from. I kept the marriage interesting. I just couldn't also be interesting enough to make him want to stay. And eventually I understood that those are different problems with different owners. The marriage didn't get boring. He got comfortable being absent from it. I am 31 now. I run in Goodale Park 4 mornings a week. I am leading a major transit corridor study that will, if the City Council approves our recommendations in September, meaningfully reduce commute times for about 80,000 people on the east side of Columbus, which feels like the kind of work I was supposed to be doing all along. I went on a date last spring. Nothing serious. Just coffee, just conversation. Just the strange and slightly terrifying experience of remembering that I am a person other people might want to sit across a table from. My best friend calls this progress. She is probably right. My mother, when I finally told her everything, cried briefly and then made me a full Sunday dinner and told me I was stronger than I knew, which is exactly what mothers say and is also, it turns out, sometimes true. The dog has a gray muzzle now. She sleeps in a patch of sun on the hardwood floor every afternoon, and she has no idea that her life is different from what it was 2 years ago, or that any of this happened, or that I cried on the couch in the dark in January with her head in my lap thinking I might not be okay. She just knows that I come home, every night. That I fill her bowl and take her to the park and sit on the floor with her in the evening and scratch behind her ears until she sighs. I think about that a lot. How being present, reliably, tenderly, without drama or condition, is not boring. It is the whole thing. It is, I've come to believe, the only thing that ever actually matters. He went looking for something more exciting than that. I stayed. And now I have it. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a cosmic sense. I'm not someone who believes the universe is keeping score or that suffering earns you a reward later. But I do believe that choices compound, that the small decisions a person makes, repeated quietly over months and years, eventually build something. And what they build is either a life worth staying in, or a door they've been inching toward without admitting it. My husband made his choices. He chose, gradually and then completely, to be absent from our marriage while physically present in it. He chose to let resentment settle into the furniture instead of saying out loud that something was wrong. He chose someone else, and then was surprised to find that someone else had her own set of wants, her own exit door, her own sense of what she was and wasn't willing to hold on to. And I made my choices too. For years, I chose to call his absence normal. I chose to shrink my ambitions to fit around a life that had stopped making room for me. I chose silence when I should have chosen honesty, and I chose hope when I should have chosen information. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because I think that's the part nobody talks about in stories like this one. The betrayal is obvious. Everyone can see it. Everyone reacts to it. But the slow erosion that happens before the betrayal, the way a person can participate in their own diminishment without realizing it, that's the part that took me longer to understand. What I learned, and I mean learned in the bone-deep way that only comes from living something, is that self-respect is not a feeling. It's a practice. It looks like keeping a savings account nobody told you to keep. It looks like saying go through my attorney when every part of you wants to just talk it out and make it easier. It looks like taking the promotion you turned down twice because you were waiting for someone to need you at home. It looks like planting a garden in a backyard you're about to sell, because the planting itself is worth something regardless of who ends up with the yard. Sienna didn't take my husband. He walked toward her because something in him needed to, and that need had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with a person who had never learned to sit still with discomfort long enough to understand it. People who chase excitement are almost always running from something. He just didn't know what. And me. I stayed. Not in the marriage. I stayed with myself. Through the months of eating dinner alone and calling it normal. Through January and the dark couch and the dog in my lap. Through the attorney's office and the parking garage and the breathing exercises. Through the apartment with the green walls and the boxes on the floor. I kept showing up for my own life even when I didn't particularly want to. That's the only thing I know how to call wisdom now. Not grand decisions. Not dramatic turning points. Just the daily, unglamorous choice to remain present in your own life. To keep building something real, even when, especially when, the person who was supposed to be building it with you has already walked out the door. He thought the life we had was boring. I think he just never learned how to see it.